Welcome back to the deep dive. We're diving deep into psilocybin and psilocin this time.
Oh, this is gonna be good.
Yes, you requested this one, so I know you're excited. You want to know how these compounds work on the brain, right? Especially for treating depression and anxiety.
Exactly. I think there's so much potential there.
So we'll be focusing on how psilocybin changes in the body, how it interacts with those serotonin receptors, and what happens in the brain as a result.
It sounds complicated.
It is, but it's fascinating, trust me.
I believe you. The research on psilocybin is really revealing some incredible things about its potential for mental health.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Psilocybin, it's what's found in magic mushrooms, right?
Right.
But psilocybin itself isn't what directly affects the brain.
That's right. It's actually what's called a prodrug. It has to be converted into psilocin in the body to actually become active.
So it's like a caterpillar transforming into a butterfly.
Uh-huh.
Psilocybin transforms into psilocin, and then things really start to happen.
Perfect analogy. And once that transformation happens, psilocin then interacts with a very specific receptor in the brain, the 5-HT2A receptor.
Okay, hold on. I know receptors are important, but why is this 5-HT2A receptor so special?
Well, the 5-HT2A receptor is part of the serotonin system, which plays a huge role in regulating mood, perception, and even cognition.
Right.
You're right, there are other serotonin receptors, but this specific one, it's particularly important when it comes to the effects of psilocybin.
So psilocin activates this receptor, and that sets off this chain reaction in the brain.
Exactly. Think of it like a key fitting into a lock. Psilocin is the key, the 5-HT2A receptor is the lock, and when they connect, it unlocks a whole bunch of events.
And one of the key outcomes of this cascade is that it increases BDNF, right?
Right.
Brain-derived neurotrophic factor, the brain fertilizer we always hear about.
Yes. BDNF is essential for neuroplasticity. That's the brain's ability to change and adapt.
Right.
It basically encourages the growth of new connections in the brain and also strengthens existing ones.
Okay, so psilocin, through this 5-HT2A receptor, leads to more BDNF, which helps the brain rewire itself. But how does that translate into actual benefits for conditions like depression and anxiety?
That's where things get really interesting. Researchers think that by promoting neuroplasticity, psilocin could help disrupt those dysfunctional circuits in the brain that contribute to these conditions.
So it's not just about boosting mood temporarily, but potentially changing the underlying structure of the brain.
Yeah.
That's pretty profound.
It is, and the research shows that these changes, they can actually be long-lasting.
Wait, so one experience with psilocybin can have lasting effects on the brain.
It can.
How is that even possible?
Well, it goes back to those signaling pathways you mentioned before. When psilocin activates that 5-HT2A receptor, it actually triggers two specific pathways, MAPKIRK and PI3-ACT.
Okay, break that down for me. What are these pathways and what do they do?
Think of them like the architects of neuroplasticity. They decide which connections get strengthened, which ones get pruned, and basically how the brain adapts and changes over time.
So they're like the construction crew, following the blueprints laid out by psilocin.
Exactly.
And this whole rewiring process
Yeah.
is what leads to those long-lasting changes.
Precisely. It's really a fascinating and complex process, and we're honestly just beginning to figure out the details of how it all works.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
But it's amazing to think psilocybin could have such a big impact on the brain. Speaking of impact, what about the experience people have on psilocybin? We're talking about rewiring and neuroplasticity, but what about the altered state of consciousness? What about those altered states of consciousness that people will often talk about?
That's a great question, and it's one that researchers are still really trying to understand. We know psilocybin can profoundly affect perception, emotion, and even a person's sense of self. But we don't know the exact neural mechanisms behind these experiences.
So we know it can lead to shifts in consciousness, but we're still trying to understand how it all happens.
Exactly, but there are some interesting theories out there. One idea is that psilocybin disrupts the normal communication patterns between different brain regions, particularly those involved in those higher order functions.
Interesting. So it's not just about activating receptors, but actually changing the way different parts of the brain talk to each other.
That's one of the main theories. And this disruption of established networks, well, it might lead to that loosening of ego boundaries and that altered sense of reality people describe.
I see. So it's like psilocybin is shaking things up in the brain, allowing new connections to form.
Precisely. And this disruption of those thought patterns and perceptions, it might be a key factor in its therapeutic potential.
Ah, so breaking free from those rigid thought patterns that contribute to depression and anxiety. It sounds like psilocybin gives the brain a chance to reset.
Yes.
And explore new possibilities.
That's the idea. And this exploration could lead to new insights and perspectives that can be incredibly healing and transformative.
This is mind-blowing. We've gone from the molecular level all the way to the bigger picture of brain rewiring and talked about the potential therapeutic effects.
And we're just getting started. There's still so much to learn about the interplay between psychedelics, the brain, and consciousness itself.
Well, I'm hooked. Let's dive deeper into those specific pathways next. MAPKIRK and PI3-CACT, and how they contribute to this whole rewiring process.
I'm ready when you are. All right, let's unpack those pathways. So imagine them as these communication networks within each brain cell. When Psilocin activates that 5-HT2A receptor, it's like sending a signal down these pathways, kind of like a chain reaction.
So it's not just an on-off switch, more like setting off a domino effect.
Exactly. And these two pathways, MAPKIRK and PI3-ACT, they're essential for neuroplasticity. They influence the growth and survival of brain cells and the formation of those new connections, those synapses that allow neurons to communicate with each other.
So if someone's struggling with depression and their brain is stuck in these negative thought patterns, could psilocybin help create new pathways, like new ways for their brain to process information?
That's one of the main theories that researchers are exploring. By boosting these signaling pathways, psilocin might be encouraging new connections, especially in areas of the brain that are important for mood regulation and emotional processing.
It's almost like psilocybin is helping the brain break free from those old paths and make new, healthier ones.
It's a great analogy, and that's why researchers are so excited about psilocybin. They think it could potentially treat conditions that are often resistant to those traditional therapies.
Okay, so we've got psilocybin transforming into psilocin, activating that 5-HT2A receptor, and then kicking off these signaling pathways that promote neuroplasticity. But are there any risks with all this rewiring? Could it lead to negative changes in the brain?
That's a really important question, and it's one that researchers are very aware of. The potential benefits of psilocybin are exciting, but it is a powerful substance and it can have strong effects on the brain.
So responsible use and careful research are key.
Absolutely. It's crucial to do really thorough research to fully understand both the risks and benefits of psilocybin, and it's important to emphasize that even in a therapeutic setting, psilocybin should only be used with the guidance of trained professionals.
Makes sense. We wouldn't want to just unleash a construction crew on the brain without any supervision. But aside from the risks, I'm curious about the research itself. What are some of the findings from studies on psilocybin and its effects?
Well, there have been fascinating studies using brain imaging techniques, like fMRI, to see what's happening in the brain when someone's on psilocybin. One key finding is that psilocybin seems to quiet down activity in a network called the default mode network.
The default mode network. Isn't that the network that's active when we're daydreaming or lost in thought?
Exactly. And it's also been linked to depression and anxiety, where people experience a lot of negative rumination. What's interesting is that psilocybin seems to decrease activity in this network, potentially giving people a break from those thought patterns.
So it's like hitting pause on that constant inner chatter. That can be so draining.
That's a great way to put it. And this quieting of the default mode network, it might be related to those feelings of ego dissolution and interconnectedness that people often experience with psilocybin.
I've heard people describe that, feeling a sense of unity with everything around them, like the boundaries between self and other disappear.
Precisely. And these experiences can be incredibly powerful. They can lead to shifts in perspective and a feeling of connection that can last.
It's like psilocybin gives the brain a chance to reboot and see the world with new eyes.
And what's even more interesting is that while the default mode network is quiet, other brain regions, especially those involved in sensory processing and emotions, they actually become more active and interconnected.
So it's not just shutting down some areas, it's also boosting activity in others.
Exactly. And this shift in activity might explain why people have heightened senses, intense emotions, and even those mystical experiences they talk about.
It's like the brain is tuning into a different frequency, picking up on signals that it usually filters out. And maybe this is key to having those insights and transformative experiences.
That's a great way to think about it. But this is just a glimpse into the complex effects of psilocybin on the brain. We still have a lot to learn, but the research is really promising.
It sounds like we're exploring a whole new world. And every discovery brings us closer to understanding the true potential of these compounds. But I have to ask, with all this focus on the 5-HT2A receptor, are there other receptors or neurotransmitters involved in the effects of psilocybin?
That's a great question. While the 5-HT2A receptor is key, psilocybin also interacts with other receptors in the brain. It's not just one interaction, it's more like a dance with multiple partners.
So psilocybin is a multitasker. interacting with all these different receptors to create these unique effects.
Exactly. Think of it as a network of pathways, with psilocybin influencing how information flows through all those channels.
Okay, can you give us some examples of how psilocybin might be influencing those other neurotransmitter systems?
One interesting area is the connection between psilocybin and the glutamate system. Glutamate is the main excitatory neurotransmitter, and it's crucial for learning, memory, and neuroplasticity.
Ah, glutamate. We've talked about that before in relation to other brain-boosting things.
Exactly, and psilocybin seems to be tapping into that system too. Studies have shown it can increase glutamate release in certain areas, especially the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in planning and emotions.
So it's boosting those excitatory signals in areas crucial for thinking and feeling good.
Precisely. And this increase in glutamate could be contributing to those changes in the brain.
I see. It's like psilocybin is helping the brain learn, adapt, and change in those areas that are so important for mental health.
That's a great way to put it. And there's also evidence that psilocybin might be affecting the dopamine system too, which is involved in reward and pleasure.
Dopamine, the pleasure chemical.
Yeah.
Is psilocybin giving us a dopamine rush?
It's not quite like that. Psilocybin doesn't directly bind to those dopamine receptors, but it does seem to indirectly influence dopamine release through its interactions with other systems like glutamate and serotonin.
So it's like that domino effect again. One neurotransmitter influences another.
Exactly. And this complex interaction between systems makes studying psilocybin a challenge, but it's also what makes it so fascinating.
It's like this incredibly intricate tapestry, with each thread being a different neurotransmitter. And psilocybin is weaving them together to create this complex experience.
I like that analogy. And it's this interaction that might explain why psilocybin can have such long-lasting effects on our mood, perception, and even behavior.
It sounds like psilocybin is orchestrating all these changes in the brain, affecting multiple systems, different regions, and ultimately the very structure of our minds.
It's a beautiful and powerful process. And while there's still so much we don't know, the research is giving us incredible insights into how psilocybin might help us heal, transform, and even expand our understanding of consciousness.
Well, I'm definitely feeling that sense of awe and wonder.
Hmm.
But I'm curious about individual differences in how people respond to psilocybin. We all have unique brains, right? And different life experiences. Do those differences play a role in how someone experiences psilocybin?
Absolutely. The experience of psilocybin is influenced by so many factors, things like genetics, personality, personal history, and psychological state.
Okay, so our DNA, our past experiences, our current mindset, all these things can shape our experience with psilocybin.
Exactly. For example, there's research looking at whether variations in genes, especially those related to the serotonin system, like the 5-HT2A receptor, could affect how people respond to psilocybin.
So if you have a certain version of that gene, you might be more likely to have a mystical experience or feel more connected to nature.
That's one theory. Of course, it's not a simple one-to-one correlation. The psilocybin experience is influenced by a lot of different things.
Is nature and nurture working together, as always?
Exactly. But understanding the genetic side of how people respond could help personalize treatments and make sure people have safe and positive experiences.
It's like having a personalized roadmap for navigating the psychedelic landscape.
Precisely. And beyond serotonin, researchers are also looking at genes related to dopamine and glutamate and how they shape the psilocybin experience.
So it's this really complex puzzle with genetics, brain chemistry, and our personal experiences. But as we learn more, we're getting closer to understanding the connection between our biology and our consciousness, just like we're decoding the language of the mind. But with all this research happening, are there any ethical considerations we should be thinking about as we explore psilocybin's potential?
That's a very important question. It's one that researchers, clinicians, and policymakers are thinking about a lot. As this field of psychedelic medicine grows,
So what are some of those ethical challenges?
one of the biggest is informed consent. Because psilocybin can cause such big changes in consciousness, it's crucial that people participating in research or therapy understand the risks and benefits.
So it's not something to be taken lightly.
Exactly. It's a powerful experience that needs preparation, a safe setting, and the guidance of professionals.
It's like embarking on a journey into uncharted territory. You want a good guide and the right equipment.
Great analogy. And beyond informed consent, there are concerns about potential abuse, the importance of cultural sensitivity, and ensuring everyone has access to treatment.
So it's not just about the science, it's about those social and ethical implications too.
Exactly. As we navigate this new world of psychedelic medicine, we need to have thoughtful conversations about these issues.
It's like building a new map. not just of the brain, but of our collective consciousness.
And it's a map that needs attention to detail, respect for human experiences, and a commitment to ethical exploration.
Well said. But before we get too philosophical,
Yeah.
I'm curious about the practical side of this research. How are these studies actually done? What does a typical psilocybin session look like in research?
That's a great question. It's a lot different from what you might picture in a recreational setting.
So, no black lights and Grateful Dead posters.
Haha, not quite. It's all about safety, comfort, and support.
So more like a spa day for the soul.
I like that. Usually it's a comfortable room, maybe with calming decor, dim lights, and some soft music.
Sounds very zen.
Exactly. And before the session, participants are carefully screened to make sure they're physically and mentally ready to participate.
So making sure they're in the right headspace for the experience.
Exactly. And during the session, they're usually lying down with eye shades on to block out any distraction.
Creating a cocoon for introspection.
And there are trained facilitators present the whole time, providing support and guidance.
So they're like psychedelic Sherpas, helping people navigate those altered states.
That's a great way to put it. The facilitators are trained to handle a wide range of experiences, from the positive and profound to the challenging and sometimes even scary.
They're like emotional first responders.
Exactly. But what about after the session? What happens then?
That's a good question. What kind of follow-up care do participants receive?
That's another really important part of responsible research. After the session, they have time to process the experience with the facilitators, to integrate those insights, and talk about any lingering thoughts or emotions.
So it's not just about the experience itself, it's about making sense of it afterwards.
Exactly. Ongoing support is essential for people to really benefit from psilocybin.
It's like having a therapist help you unpack your psychedelic suitcase and go through all those souvenirs you brought back.
I love that analogy. This integration process can involve journaling, art therapy, or simply talking to loved ones about the experience.
So it's about bringing those insights back into everyday life.
Exactly. And as research continues, we're learning more and more about how to support people in integrating those experiences.
It's like we're creating a whole new language for talking about and understanding consciousness.
That's a great way to put it. It's what makes this field so exciting. It's not just about treating illness, it's about expanding what it means to be human.
It really is amazing how much we're learning about the brain through studying psychedelics. It's like we're opening up this whole new world of understanding. But before we get carried away, I want to talk about something we haven't touched on much. The history of psilocybin. It's not exactly a new discovery, is it?
No, definitely not. Psilocybin has a long and fascinating history. It goes back thousands of years. There's evidence suggesting it was used in rituals and ceremonies by indigenous cultures, especially in Mesoamerica.
So it wasn't just a 60s thing.
Not at all. It's been connected to human spirituality and consciousness for centuries. The modern interest in psilocybin can be traced back to the 1950s. That's when Western scientists really started studying its effects.
So ancient wisdom meets modern science like a lot of things.
Exactly. And in the 60s, people got really interested in its potential for therapy. But then political changes led to psilocybin being classified as a Schedule I drug, which basically stopped all research for decades.
It's crazy how something with such a long history can suddenly become taboo, but it sounds like things are changing again.
They are. In recent years, there's been a renewed interest in psilocybin's potential for therapy. And research is slowly starting to pick up again.
It's like psilocybin is making a comeback.
It is. And it's happening at a time when we're realizing the limitations of traditional psychiatric medications. And we need new ways to treat mental health conditions.
It feels like we're on the verge of a whole new way of thinking about mental health and healing. So what are researchers focusing on now? What's next for psilocybin research?
Well, a big area is its potential for treating depression and anxiety. There are trials going on right now to see how effective it is in different situations, from palliative care to severe depression.
So they're not just looking at a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right. They're exploring how it could be used for different people and conditions.
And are there any other areas they're looking into?
Oh, definitely. Besides depression and anxiety, people are interested in using it for addiction, PTSD, even cluster headaches.
Wow, that's a wide range.
It is. And there's research on microdosing psilocybin, too. Taking really small amounts that don't cause psychedelic effects, but might boost creativity and focus.
Microdosing. That's something I've been hearing a lot about.
Yeah, it's an interesting area, but we need more research.
With all this research happening, it seems like psilocybin is moving from the fringes back into the mainstream. But what challenges are researchers facing?
Well, the legal status of psilocybin is still a big hurdle. Because it's a scheduleless drug, it's really hard to get funding and do research.
That's so frustrating, especially when you think about the potential benefits we could be missing out on.
I know. But even with those challenges, there's a growing group of scientists, clinicians, and advocates who are passionate about this research. I'm hopeful that as we learn more about its safety and how well it works, the laws will change eventually.
It feels like a tough battle, but hopefully science and reason will win in the end.
I think so too. And it's not just about science, it's about changing how people think about psychedelics. For so long, these substances have had such a bad reputation, they've been misunderstood.
It's like they've been seen as the bad guys when they could actually be really helpful.
Exactly. We need to educate people about the science behind psychedelics, to get rid of the myths and fears, and to have a more open and honest conversation about them.
It's about reintroducing these compounds to the world in a new way, recognizing both their power and their potential to heal.
Exactly. And that's what makes this such an exciting field to be in right now. We're seeing a big change in how we think about mental health and the healing power of these amazing substances.
Well, I think we've covered a lot in this deep dive into psilocybin and psilocin. We've gone from the tiny details to the big picture of consciousness, explored the science, history, the potential for therapy, and even the ethical side of it all.
We have. It's been a fascinating journey.
It really has. I'm leaving with a sense of awe and wonder, but also a lot of hope. To think we might have these tools to help people struggling with mental health is really inspiring.
I feel the same way. Research on psilocybin is opening up so many new possibilities for understanding the brain, consciousness, and how we can heal. And this is just the beginning.
I can't wait to see where it all leads. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep an open mind.